Hi there, I'm Spatial Shark, Mr. Turner. Oh, if you've seen my Bitmoji classroom, you understand all the arsenal gear. Here, I'll go without since I'm at home. I guess you're at home too. We're starting the year remotely. But I wanted to make sure that I have available for you these slides that will kind of partner along with the book that we will use in our class, written by my friend David Palmer. It's the AMSCO book for human geography. And this first unit is thinking geographically. And my bubble up there in the corner, hopefully we'll try to avoid covering up slides too much. But at any rate, I wanted to walk through these slides with you so that you can get a nice overview of everything that's in Unit 1. Now, this video will be very long. It's probably going to be longer than your attention span. They say it's about a minute for every year of age that you are. And I'm like the biggest 15-year-old in the room usually. So this will be way too long, but you can chunk it. You can watch it repeatedly. It'll be posted on my YouTube channel. So you'll have access to it all the time. This won't necessarily be what we're using in class, because in class we'll have other slides and other work that we'll be doing that will be the application of what you're learning by watching this slideshow. So obviously reading the book, obviously watching the slides, really critical, but it's kind of like this flipped model where like colleges are doing a lot nowadays, you're kind of learning before you come into class. And then when we're in class, we have time to work together so that I can make sure you understand all of these topics and skills and what will be tested so that you can do the best job that you can do, taking for what many of you will be your first AP class, right? Advanced placement. So this is thinking geographically. And so what we're going to do is we'll go through and we'll look at, why geography matters. Thinking geographically is teaching you how geography is everything and everything is geographical. So I found some images just by Google searching around, and this is kind of funny. There's always these mistakes in the media, and it says, Trump cuts aid to 3 Mexican countries. As far as I know, there's only 1 Mexican country. There may be other countries that are Latin or that are Hispanic, speaking Spanish, culturally similar, but, this is clearly a headline that is incorrect. And it's not just Fox that gets it wrong. It's not just CNN. It's not just MSNBC. It's all of them. And in reality, think about when you're out and about, how many people really are not geographically literate. Here's one from CNN from a couple of years ago. These giant hornets, they're killing people, and it's, striking Hong Kong. And of course, they show us a map here, and that's not Hong Kong. That's not even Asia. That's South America. And they're pointing to, what probably would be where, Sao Paulo would be in Brazil. So we know that geography is important. We know that a spatial perspective is essential. And one thing that I think you're going to notice as you go through these slides and as you read the book is you're going to see a lot of vocabulary, but there's going to be 2 words that are going to be more important than anything else we do. And you're going to see these words repeatedly in the course and exam description, in the skills, in the topics. Those 2 words are patterns and processes. Geographers will ask where and why there, and then they'll usually say, why do we care about that? But patterns are what you see, and the processes are what explains the patterns of what you see. And really, this is really a critical thing for you guys. Being young people, teenagers at this time, being very tech savvy with your phones and with your data and your devices, companies, organizations, governments at all levels, local, state, and federal, are collecting data on us. Every time you click something, every time you buy something, every time you interact, your data is being collected, and that data is being used to make decisions. And we'll talk about that as we get into our course. But that's what makes human geography so fascinating, right? Geographers always asking the where and the why there questions. And companies increasingly are paying big money to young people coming out of school who have these skills with geospatial analysis, the collection of data, the mining of the data, the understanding of the data, and the analysis of what does the data mean? What does this mean for our company? And how can we better compete with our competitors, with other companies that want market share like we do? And so this is, all about providing services and increasing your competitive edge. In order to do that, remember, we talk about data, it's got to be both quantitative and qualitative data. And we'll talk about that in class, of course, but quantitative data, it's numerical, it's data driven, but it's number crunching, whereas qualitative data is more about the acquisition of data that has characteristics or has qualities about it. And again, when we think about processes, right, those processes can be economic, they can be social cultural, they can be political, and they can be environmental. You have to work with me a little bit on the environmental there, but it's the N, but ESPN, and that's going to be big in our course throughout this year. Remember, I said that geographers ask about where and why there. Well, sometimes we call that the why of where. It's an inquiry, right? It's questions. And geography is a science. And you should remember, hopefully from middle school, maybe even earlier, that the scientific method always starts off with people making an observation, right? Newton's sitting under a tree, the apple hits him in the head. Gee, I wonder why that apple fell. You start with an inquiry, you start with an observation, you start with a question, and then you start to go out and actually employ the scientific principles. So when we ask about the where and the why there, that's what we're doing. We're doing the science of geography. If you want to stop and pause for a second, you can read through and look at some of the questions that I've posed here. Clearly, how soccer explains the world. We'll talk a lot about things in class, but field work, again, getting out in the field and asking questions, right? But if you want to take a moment, read that slide, go ahead. I'll be back in just a second. So now that you've read and you've looked at the slide, one guy I want to introduce you to, Alexander von Humboldt. Some people will say he's the father of what we call human geography. In the 1800s, he traveled extensively. His name is actually on a lot of physical features around the world, one of them being the Humboldt Current that you might have learned about if you take ACE marine biology in the future. But he was a world traveler, but also a scientist and a prodigious writer. He wrote down everything about where he went and what he found while he was there. So he talked about the most dangerous worldview is the worldview of those who have not viewed the world. Well, that's pretty obvious. And don't you think that even in today's world right now, that's very true. Things that are happening close to us, things that are happening far away from us, but increasingly interconnected. Geography is everything and everything is geographical. I want you to think like a geographer. Right. And so when we think about, traveling, for example, we've all been curtailed from that lately. But that's one thing that we like to do. At our school, we have a history of taking kids on trips during spring break. And we've been to some crazy places. We've been to Peru. We've been to Australia. We've been to South Africa. We've been to Egypt. We've been to China. And of course, we go to Europe every other year. But when we think about it, this is opportunities to get out and see the world and understand that the more people we think they're different, a lot of us are really more the same than we think. Right? So what is human geography? Again, I'll let you take a look at this for a second. But basically, again, I said everything is geographical. So you look at all the courses that you'll take throughout high school and even beyond, and the work that you may do in your career, and you can find a connection between every career path, every skill set, and human geography, right? It really is the most relevant thing and the most rigorous thing you've probably ever had to do so far in school, right? And that's why I'm excited about the opportunities that we have this year to get you to become more geographically literate and to be able to think geographically. So we know that, we got an issue with disease going on in the world right now. But this is not the first disease that has been big in the news. 100 years ago, there was the Spanish influenza. Even before that, cholera used to break out in Europe and even in the United States and all over the world. And if you go back to the Middle Ages, you find out about the Black Death and the bubonic plague and those kinds of things. So again, think about disease and think about the study of disease, epidemiology, right? The study of disease across time and space. That's a big issue in our country right now. Well, in 1850s London, there was an outbreak of cholera, and a geographer helped to stop that outbreak by using a map and pinpointing the location of every case of cholera. And what they figured out, if you look at the screen right there in the middle, hey, there's that one pump of water that's, obviously contaminated. Well, cholera is a waterborne disease, and therefore they shut down that pump. And look at that. The cholera outbreaks were mitigated because of that. So this is what we see, is that geography is all about patterns and processes, right? And you have to think like a geographer. So look at these two maps here, and I'll toggle back and forth between where California kids prefer to live and where Pennsylvania kids prefer to live. And we assume we're talking about when they get out of college or when they start going out into the world of work, would they like to stay at home? Well, look, most of them clearly prefer to stay close to California, right? Near things are more related than distant things. We'll talk about that. It doesn't seem like a lot of people from either California or Pennsylvania prefer to go into the deep South. Well, is that because it's culturally different? Is that because economically incomes there are not as high and maybe jobs don't pay as much? Is it partly due to climate? Is it because of political conditions? This is where we start to think about that ESPN, right? Economic, social, cultural, political, environmental. Is it because California kids, dude, we're in California, brah. And you get into the deep South and it's like, hey, how y'all doing? Maybe that's just a little bit of a difference there that prevents them from wanting to go to those places, right? But this is what we mean, patterns and processes. So I want you to think about the 5 themes of geography. Pretty much everything we do this year is going to talk about these 5 themes, right? Location, human environment interaction, regions, place, and movement, right? And in no particular order, right? But these are the 5, and we'll talk about all 5. And again, when you go through the course, you'll start to make connections, and that's going to be really important. That's why what we do in class is the application of some of this knowledge, and what you do at home watching these slideshows is the acquisition of that knowledge. When I went on a lot of college tours with my son Michael, who is now in his 4th year at University of Florida, he's in the Fisher School of Accounting in the Honors College. A lot of the places that we toured, they would tell us, your child has everything ever known in their pocket, because your phone, hello, Alexa, Siri, Google, tell me what I don't know. Acquisition of knowledge is easy nowadays, right? You just ask your phone and you can find it. You can read, you can acquire. What colleges are increasingly hoping that you're able to do is that you're taking what you know and then being able to apply it into new situations, to be able to solve problems, to be able to understand, right? And that's a big, big skill. And we're going to be very skill-based this year, and we'll talk about that. Right. So the 5 themes, sometimes, they'll say they're a little bit outdated. They're still valuable, but there are now a newer set of 6 essential elements of what it means to be geographically literate. And, I'll show you those in just a second, but I want you to stop for a second. Here's a good chance to pause, right? And look at these 5 themes, right? And I'll give you a second to stop the video and take a look at it. When we come back, I'll talk to you about what these 5 themes mean. Okay, we're back. And 5 themes of geography. You had a chance to look at location and place and human environment interaction, movement and regions. Here's a little bit of a different take on that. But I want you to notice how much of the 6 essentials, the 6 essential elements of geography, really just mirror those 5 themes, right? You're looking at the world in spatial terms, right? Locations, places and regions, physical systems and human systems, and especially human environment interaction. And especially the usages of geography, right? How people are using geography on an individual basis, how they're using it at their job, and how governments are using geography as well to be able to make decisions, provide services, to tax us, and those kinds of things, right? So if we go through these themes, right? Location, we can talk about absolute or relative location. We'll actually do some of that in class. And you guys will do some work that I'll walk you through so that you can understand the practical parts of this vocabulary. But of course, it's very important that you know the terms. We can make jokes about location. The realty people will tell you that there's only 3 things important when you buy a house: location, location, location. One of your parents may be a realtor, maybe both. Boca is a big area for real estate. But it's funny, the old story of the 3 little pigs, the house made out of straw, the house made out of wood, the house made out of brick, and the big bad wolf huffs and puffs and blows it all down or whatever. But the reality is, even if you build this house made out of the most solid stone, if you build it next to a sausage factory and you're a pig, that's probably not the best place for your house to be, right? Considering that, we're going to send those animals off to the slaughterhouse in there, right? So when we think about location, right, here's a picture that I always think of. A couple of years ago, we took the kids to South Africa. And from Cape Town, we drove about an hour south of Cape Town, and we went to the Cape Point, right? Not the Cape of Good Hope, that's a little bit further down, but the Cape Point. It's about an hour's drive from Cape Town. Or, that's relative location. Or you could talk about absolute location. Well, look, you got the coordinates right there on the sign. Gee, why do you think a geography educator would want to take a picture in front of this sign, right? But the idea is that's the precise location. That's the absolute location. Relative location measures, next to something else that right? Oh, Spanish River, that's across the street from my neighborhood, or that's down Jog Road from where I live, right? So, and again, if you're a kid watching these videos that maybe is not a Spanish River shark, all right, think about in your application of all of these words, what are some examples that you can use? Because that's what's really key about this human geography course, right? So we'll talk about place, and you can look at place. Again, read through these, maybe pause and take a second in the video and think about sense of place. If you've been to Ground Zero in New York City, right? If you've been to the site of the World Trade Center towers that came down on 9/11, it is an overwhelming gravity of that sense of place. You feel it. It's almost like you can understand what it must have been like to be there on that day. If you live in a typical suburban area of the United States, and Boca is very much like this, and I'll tell you even better, the mall, right? If you go to any mall in America, guess what? There's going to be a food court, probably going to be a Chick-fil-A, right? There's going to be an Apple store, right? There's going to be a Victoria's Secret. There's going to be all these different stores, right? That's placelessness, right? Oh, there's nothing unique. There's nothing special. There's nothing different. It looks the same, right? So when we think about place, we're thinking about the human and the physical characteristics that make that place unique, right? And I've got some questions there that you can take a second to think about. Okay, so thinking about place characteristics, this is New Orleans. This is New Orleans before Katrina, and this is New Orleans after Katrina, right? And notice that the physical site didn't change. The situation was different. We'll talk about site and situation in a few minutes here, right? But this is what we mean by place. Is there something about New Orleans physically that made this more likely to happen? Yeah, it's on the Gulf Coast. That's a big part of it. Hurricanes go up through there. It's also in a bowl. It's kind of a recessed area. It's surrounded by water. You've got Lake Pontchartrain to the north. The Mississippi River flows across the city to the south. So it's pretty much in a depression that's surrounded by water on all sides. So when you had a devastating storm like Katrina go through, clearly it's going to have an environmental and an economic impact. Of course, the parts of New Orleans that suffered the most were the areas of the lowest income. That's not crazy to think about in the United States, where oftentimes, because of some policies of the past, lower income folks live in areas that maybe aren't the best. We saw it with water crisis in Flint, Michigan, and definitely we'll talk about that as we get into some of the urban units later this year. All right, but that's what I mean by geography is everything, and everything is geographical. You think about place characteristics. So we mentioned site and situation. So let's talk a little bit about it. Physical characteristics of site. Situation being relative, and situation can be economic, social, cultural, political, and it can change over time, right? And so some of the discussion that I just had there with New Orleans can help you with that. But also think about some of these questions that I've asked in the slideshow. I love the movie Cars, right? I'm a sucker for Lightning McQueen, right? And it's the idea that when the big highway went past Radiator Springs, the town died because nobody went to Radiator Springs anymore until Lightning McQueen became famous, and then everybody wanted to go to Radiator Springs, and then Mater got to give tours, right, of the museum. Doc Hudson's museum with Mrs. the King, right? Richard Petty. So when you think about site and situation, right, these are different ways to describe the relationships, right, between the physical spaces and the human places that we have created. So you think about how technology has a role in this, right? Distance, right? It's an obstacle to overcome. But nowadays, distance is less of a factor because of technology, because of transportation and communication technologies. And so we can look at some of these examples that I have on this slide. And you guys are using apps that maybe your parents don't even know about, and you're able to connect. And we talk about accessibility and connectivity between those apps. As teacher and as student, look at what we're doing here with videos that are going to be on a YouTube channel. We're teaching virtually. Remember, you're capable of virtually anything this year. So, we're going to use a Remind app. We're going to have a Google Classroom. You've seen my Bitmoji classroom. There's all these cool ways that we have accessibility and connectivity. Right? If you want to Google search Dean Screen, you can check out that night in American political history and find out what happened to Howard Dean, who was leading the race for the Democratic nomination at the time. He went from the front runner to literally no chance to win based on one small video clip that just went viral in the most embarrassing way for him. So if you want to check that out, it's actually pretty entertaining. And I think it'll drive home what I mean by the pace of cultural change. So when we think about the word globalization, right, this is just a really popular term in social studies nowadays. Disney's right. It really is a small world after all. Transportation and communication are making the world more interconnected all the time. And this, of course, has impacts, right? Cultural impacts, language, religion, all kinds of ideas that are being exchanged, money issues where we have trade. I can invest in the Asian markets, the European markets, the emerging markets of Latin America, Africa. All of this colonialism and imperialism in the past, the neo-colonialism that's happening nowadays with the more powerful, richer countries manipulating and dominating the lesser countries, lesser economically developed countries. And so we talk about this idea of Tobler, right? Toblerisms. Waldo Tobler, a very famous geographer who talked about everything's related to everything else, but near things are more related than distant things. And it's so true. The stuff that's happening in your local area impacts you maybe more than stuff from far away. But we all know with the social justice movements that are going on right now that, George Floyd happening in Minneapolis affects everyone at their local level as well, even though that happened at a national level somewhere else, right? And then now it's even affecting, for example, British soccer players, right? The Premier League, when they came back, all players took a knee, right? Something that was a big issue in America, taking a knee, all right, with Colin Kaepernick, now is happening in every sport all across the world. So this is what we mean by the pace of the cultural change and the interactiveness of it, and especially the idea that technology is making these connections more readily adaptable and acceptable, right? And again, transportation and communication are really, really important. Right? So technology is going to reduce the impact of that difference. So I told you a little bit about Tobler. You can see that here, right? But I wanted to kind of show you what that looks like, right? So a typical distance decay model, right? And the idea of distance decay is that, shorter distances, interaction is going to be higher, right? And the farther the distance, that interaction is going to decrease. Well, technology changes that. It's not a perfect, equidistant effect. The areas that are more accessible and are more connected are, distance is going to seemingly be less, right? If there's a direct flight every day to a certain city, right, there's going to be more interaction than if I have to connect 3 different flights to get to this far off city. That, maybe the distances are about the same, but it's easier to get to one than it is to get to the other, or maybe there's connections communications wise. And that's what we mean by Toblerisms, right? Everything's related to everything else, but near things are more related than distant things. And I told you, about Disney, and let's be honest, Disney, he was brilliant. It really is a small world after all, right? And when you travel, you'll see that. Mark Twain, very famous quote, right? And he wrote this book called Innocents Abroad. And he said that, travel is fatal to prejudice, right? And there's so many people, this is his quote, so many people who sorely need it. And this is a guy who's writing a couple hundred years ago. And again, it's kind of like the same thing nowadays, right? So when you get a chance to go out and see the world, and I've been very lucky, I've been to more countries than I've been to states in the United States. And, hopefully, knock wood, I get to go to Antarctica sometime, because that's it for me, right? I've been to South America, been to Africa, been to Europe, been to Asia, right? Been to Australia, right? And it's so embarrassing because, people are like, oh, you've been to Australia twice, I feel bad sometimes telling people that, but it's, it is an opportunity, right, to get out and see and eat different food and see the sights and smell the smells and taste the tastes and talk to people and learn a little bit of their language. They love it when you can say please and thank you and those kinds of things. So one of the other themes, human environment interaction. This one's pretty self-explanatory. I can let you look at the slide. We're going to talk about sustainability. We're going to talk about that a lot. Two competing theories, environmental determinism versus possibilism. And especially, we're going to learn about the 5 twos, right? Where people generally don't live in the world, where it's too hot, too cold, too wet, too dry, too rocky, right? We're kind of like Goldilocks. We like it to be just right, right? You can take a look at the slide. So when you think about human environment interaction, look at all these connections. And again, talking about relationships, right? Human geography is all about studying relationships between places, right? Between different countries, between different cities, between different communities or neighborhoods within Palm Beach County or even within Boca Raton, East Boca versus West Boca. So when we think about the connectivity and we think about the human environment interaction, this schematic does a great job of showing that, right? And then you think of something like possibilism, the rice terraces. This one happens to be in the Philippines, where the physical environment, basically tried to say, you can't grow rice. But the people found a way to overcome the limitations of the environment. And they said, okay, well, we're going to take our innovation. We're going to cut into the side of the hills and we're going to, grow rice. We'll flood those levels with water and we'll grow our rice that way. And you can see this all over the world, where in mountainous terrains, people have come up with these ingenious ways, right, to solve the problems of their environment. So when we think about the cultural landscape, this is where you get the marriage between the human landscape, right, the built landscape and the physical world, right? And we call that sometimes cultural ecology. Culture always means way of life, and anything eco is going to be about the environment, right? Like ecotourism, or if you have an EcoBoost engine in your car. So when we think about the physical landscape, that's the natural features. But then the humans will come through and they will change that. And that's what we mean by the cultural landscape. And this is where we can read the landscape as a geographer. And that's what they'll sometimes ask you on the AP exam is, they'll show you a picture and they want you to look at it. What's in the background? What's in the foreground? What are the human characteristics? What's been built? What was natural? How did people overcome the physical environment? What are some examples of economic or social cultural or political or environmental? And so every unit we do, I want you to think geographically, think like a geographer, right? When a geographer goes to a new place or does field work, they're going to look around, they're going to observe, they're going to listen to people, they're going to, talk to people, they're going to, get a sense of place. And we'll talk about that. Of course, over time, a place can change as the group of people who are the dominant group in that area changes. You think about Miami, right? Miami used to be a very Anglo city before 1960s. But of course, with Castro in Cuba and Mrs. Turner's my in-laws, her parents came from Cuba in the 1950s. And, the city has changed. The street names change, the neighborhoods change, the restaurants change, the stores change. This is what we mean by sequence occupancy, right? Over time, different groups of people will move in, all right? And we'll talk about that as we get into the urban section of our class as well. This is what we mean by a cultural landscape. What do you see, right? Well, isn't this like almost every suburban part of the United States? You drive through almost any town or city of any substantial size, and you're going to see all the same fast food restaurants. You're going to see the same types of businesses and services being provided. Well, what if you were in like rural India, where, you're going down this kind of, small street here and you've got animals, particularly cows. We'll talk about that in the culture unit, right? With the religiousness, right? And the idea that the cows are sacred. So when we think about this, you can easily read a landscape, but then at the same time, look at the signage, right? First of all, it's in English. What does that tell us about the colonial history of India? It's about internet service and it says it's fast. Do you think it's as fast as what you have here in the States? And so you think about all of this is degrees, right? And relationships, right? And, we know that it's a computer, but is it the same kind of computer we have? Do they have free Wi-Fi like we would expect free Wi-Fi, right? Okay, so how's that cultural landscape changing over time? Certainly in the world today, we see the impact of money on the landscape. In any place in the world that has money, you're going to see tall buildings, right? The biggest number of tall buildings in the world nowadays, it's in Asia, particularly in the Middle East. You go to Dubai in the Emirates, right? Hello, fly Emirates. If you go to the Middle East, you're going to see there's tons of money, obviously from oil, but you're going to see a lot of big buildings in places like China and India are being built as well. And of course, we've had them in Europe and the United States for a long time. Not so much in Latin America. There's some. Not so much in Africa, although there's some. And so I have a cool map here that's going to show you where the tallest buildings in the world are. I've actually been lucky to go up into some of these tallest buildings in the world. One of the ones that was the most amazing is in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, right? The Petronas Twin Towers. And they're 88 stories high, which is the same as the Empire State Building back here in the States. But also to go up into the Jinmao Tower in Shanghai, China. Just some really, really cool places. But all of them are kind of the same. They're big, tall, glass, steel towers, and big businesses, especially banks, like to put their names all over those big tall buildings, right? So this is what we mean, whether it's authentic or whether it's a borrowed landscape. And a lot of it nowadays is borrowed, but sometimes they try to make it authentic. They try to make it like, if it's an Irish pub, they want it to be authentic. It's supposed to smell like wood, and right, the Guinness better be, room temperature, only Americans drink that beer cold, right? So the idea is that the landscape can change depending on the people and the ESPN impacts and the processes, right? Okay, so clearly New York City, that's another tall building that Spatial Shark's been privileged enough to get up into. And of course, if you go up to the One World Trade Center, you can get an amazing commanding view of New York City. I actually prefer sometimes going up in the Empire State Building, much shorter, but if you're in Midtown, you get to look back towards downtown, which is where the tip of Manhattan Island is here, and you can see some cool things, right? But here's that map showing you the tallest buildings in the world. And again, look at that concentration. Southeast and East Asia there, with half of the top 100 tall buildings in the world. But then look at that concentration again, like I said, in the Middle East, right? And then, like I said, North America has a lot, Europe, tall buildings, but nowadays with the super mega tall ones, Europe has kind of fallen behind. Think about that. Culturally, Europe always wanted churches to be the tallest buildings generally. So there are some skyscrapers. That one in the UK there is the Shard that's in London. It's the tallest building there. And like I said, you'll see a couple here and there around the rest of the world, but that concentration really is in Asia. And if you think about it, there's a really cool book out right now. The guy's name is Parag Khanna, and he says, the future is Asian, right? So think about that. And that doesn't necessarily mean Chinese, right? That's talking about all of the countries within Asia, right? India as well, talking about places like Vietnam, places like Thailand, places like Malaysia, Indonesia, South Korea. These are all big, big, strong economies as well. Okay, we're going to talk about the last of these themes here. We're actually penultimate, right? Movement, and then we'll talk about regions as well. Movement, of course, we talked about accessibility and connectivity already. You can read this slide and you can certainly look at the idea of movement. But I want you to think of movement as not just migration or not just shipping and imports and exports, but also the spread of ideas, right? And we'll talk about different kinds of diffusion, whether it's expansion diffusion or whether it's relocation diffusion. We'll do that in Unit 3. But again, distance is sometimes a barrier to that, but technology has made that less so. Right? But if you think about something, for example, even pollution, right? 95% of all the plastic that's in the oceans of the world today comes from just 10 rivers. And notice where they all are. They're in countries that are less developed economically. Well, think about that the next time you're in Boca and they'll only give you a paper straw, right? And you're like, well, it's not really us that's putting a lot of the plastic in the ocean. It's actually other places in the world. But every little straw counts, I'm sure, right? But think about it, right? Everything's related to everything else. Near things more related than distant things, right? Regions, our fifth and final theme. And of course, we're going to talk about different kinds of regions in class. You can stop and pause and read through this slide to learn about the different kinds of regions: formal, sometimes called uniform; functional, sometimes called nodal; and perceptual, sometimes called vernacular, right? So I'll give you a second to take a look at this. Okay, so when you think about the different kinds of regions, it's always important to think about examples, right? And so I gave you some examples on the slide there, but you think about this. What are some examples of regions that you could probably identify or describe? What are the characteristics that make those places, unique, right? Because remember, any region, what's the one common denominator? They're going to have some common characteristic or activity. All right. It's going to define it as that region. The other thing about regions that's interesting is the word region can be applied at different scales. We could talk about a region of Florida, like South Florida, or we could talk about a region of the United States, like the Midwest, or we could talk about a region of the world, like, sub-Saharan Africa. So that word region is sometimes an interchangeable term as well. This map is showing you different parts of the United States. Of course, this is by state, but states theoretically can serve as a regional level as well. But clearly we can see here that, we're talking about who has a bachelor's degree or better. In other words, who's going to college? And of course, we know that has a lot to do with income, right? So look, the Deep South, right? Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas, Tennessee, Kentucky, up into Appalachia, up into West Virginia. Much, much less college completion there, right? And therefore, that's going to have an impact economically and socially, culturally, and politically, right? So you look at other places where education is very high, like up in the northeastern United States or in the middle Atlantic states, Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, New Jersey. Colorado, very high. Washington, very high. Theoretically, even California, Illinois, New York, pretty high, right? So again, think about, does that affect voting patterns? Does that affect the types of jobs that are done? All right, look through the middle of the country, right? Our rectangular flyover states that are very agricultural, and notice that, academic completion is a little bit less there as well. So it has a lot to do with it. We also think about a functional region, right, being where an activity takes place. And of course, commuters going in and out of a big city is a good example of a functional region. Functional regions, remember, there always has to be some transportation or communication network that makes it possible, as opposed to the formal regions like we just saw. There's going to be that common uniform characteristic that as soon as that characteristic no longer applies, you're not in that region anymore. And then finally, the perceptual regions. You see these a lot, and we talk about these a lot as Americans, the kind of the mental definitions of what these regions are. When we think about the South and we say, oh, that's where people watch NASCAR, or that's where, people are more conservative and probably Baptist, and, they drive a pickup truck, right? That's these are perceptions, right? These are people's ideas, right? There's certainly you can find people in the South that vote liberal and drive a hybrid vehicle, and they're different than maybe what we would expect to find. And that's where, again, you being geographically literate and thinking geographically, you're going to learn so much about different places, right? In your world, right? In your local community, at a regional level, at a national level, at a global level. That's what's so fun about this class. The College Board has these two maps that I'm about to show you. And these are the regions that they expect you to know, right? So this wouldn't be a bad thing to kind of stop for a second and say, do I really know all these names? And could I locate all these places on a world map? This regional level is maybe one step up. And to zoom in a little bit, we would say, oh, okay, these same regional names, but now let's just get a little more precise, right? And so this is what I meant by regions being able to kind of zoom in and zoom out and change scale a little bit, right? And we'll talk about scale, obviously, throughout the year. That's going to be a huge, huge skill set for us in this class. Right, so map basics, all right, and I'll go through some of these maps with you. Essentially, we need to know that all maps are going to lie. If a map is flat, it's a flat out lie. There's only one real way that you can represent the surface of the earth, because it's a spherical thing, and that's to create a globe, right? Eratosthenes, the Greek mathematician, thousands of years ago, remarkably accurately calculated the circumference of the earth. Right. And so when we think about it, we know that the earth is rounded. We know that it's spherical. We know basically the physical characteristics of our earth. But in order to put that onto a flat map, we have to have what's called distortion. Right. And so what's going to happen is we project that rounded image of the Earth onto a flat surface, and that's going to end up creating some problems for us with both size and shape and those kinds of things, right? So we'll do a lot of this, of course, in class, all right, but you can certainly take time out to read, especially about latitude and longitude. Chanel's barking anyway, so while I go take care of the little Bichon, the 10 pounds of terror, you can take a look at this portion of the slide. So when we think about distortion, right, the idea of a spherical Earth, we have a grid, right? We have longitude, latitude, right? We have a framework for this. And so when we think about these lines, right, they are parallel if they're the east-west latitude lines. And if they're the meridians, they connect at the poles, right? They come together at the poles. And therefore, we can measure distances, right, based on this grid framework. We also know that this will affect climate. Areas that have the same latitude around the world, right, are going to be connected by climate. So if you look at 40 degrees north there, you notice that runs through the Mediterranean, and we know that the Mediterranean is famous for growing grapes and making wine, right? France, Italy, Spain, Portugal, all those countries, big wine growers. Well, follow 40 degrees over with me, and look at that. You end up in California. Oh, wait. Does California grow grapes and make wine? If you go to 40 south of the equator, you get the exact same effect. Chile, Argentina, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand. Oh my God, if I walk through Publix and look at the wine, right, you're going to see that those are the countries that are the big wine producers. So latitude and longitude, really important for us. Now, the different projections, right? This one's famous. It's the Mercator projection, so called because Gustavus Mercator is the one who created it. And he was, seeking to create a navigationally perfect map. You notice that the lines are at right angles. True north is true north. If you draw a straight line on this map, you're going in a single direction. Only problem is, remember I said that those meridians, the longitude lines, come together at the poles. Well, when you spread those out, you end up with this enormous Greenland and this enormous Antarctica. And remember, Antarctica is a circle, really, on a globe. But if you look at this, you know this is Mercator as soon as you see Greenland like that. By the way, fun fact, Greenland, it takes 11 Greenlands to make one South America. That's how distorted this map is. Now, there's a map called the Gall-Peters projection. It's almost the exact opposite of Mercator. It's very rectangular like this, but instead of the poles being stretched, the poles get tiny, and then the middle of the Earth gets stretched. So like Africa looks long and kind of stretched and distorted. So that's how you'll kind of see that one. The Robinson projection used to be very popular with National Geographic, and it was used for quite a long time. They've since gone to a more technical projection of a map, but you'll always recognize Robinson because it's flat at the top and the bottom and it's rounded on the sides, and that's kind of a compromise idea so that they can make it like that. An even bigger compromise is what's called the Goods-Homologene projection. And this is one that is it doesn't conform to the size and the shape, and it certainly is not equal area. It's a compromise. And really what they've done is they cut out the water. I always say it's like a kindergartner with a pair of scissors took a hold of the map, cut it all up. But the idea is by removing the water, you make the land so much more accurately displayed. Okay, even more than all these projections, you're going to be walking around with mental maps all year long, right? You've got a mental map of your house. You have a mental map of the school you went to in middle school. You probably don't have a very good mental map yet of Spanish River High School. And if you're a freshman somewhere else, probably the same thing. And if we're all at home using virtual education for a couple of weeks or a couple of months, maybe you don't get to know your school anytime soon. Hopefully we do, right? Hopefully we're back. But the idea is that all of this is your mental map. It's your education and your experience. A couple of years ago, Miss Teen USA was from South Carolina. Miss Teen South Carolina was asked a question about Americans and maps. And I want you to watch this for a second. It's pretty entertaining, but it tells you a lot about what I've been talking about geographical literacy. She's not super geographically literate.
Recent polls have shown a fifth of Americans can't locate the U.S. on a world map. Why do you think this is?
I personally believe that U.S. Americans are unable to do so because some people out there in our nation don't have maps, and I believe that our education, such as in South Africa and the Iraq, everywhere such as, and I believe that they should our education over here in the U.S. should help the U.S. or should help South Africa. It should help the Iraq and the Asian countries, so we will be able to build up our future for our.
Thank you very much, South Carolina.
What's amazing about that, first of all, is that Mario still looks the exact same age. I mean, from the time he was on Saved by the Bell, he's literally not aged at all. Meanwhile, I mean, I'm like old as dirt. It's just not fair. But at any rate, what did South Africa do wrong that she's picking on South Africa and the Iraq? Right? It's just kind of funny here how people get to geography and they suddenly get terrified, right? They're paralyzed with geographical illiteracy. Right? But this is what we're talking about, right? The idea to think like a geographer. When I asked you how big was Africa, right? How many of you could really take the physical sizes of all these places and put it inside Africa, right? How many of you, when you think about what's on the other side of the world from you right now, right? Because if you think about Florida, right? Look where you would be if you literally went straight through the core of the earth. We'd be off the western coast of Australia out there in the middle of the Indian Ocean, right? So when we think about the earth and we think about where we are and geography, sometimes we're a little off, right? So old cartoon here from back in the days when people used to read these things called newspapers. And it's the Family Circus. I used to love this when I was a kid. And they're taking the friend home from school and the friend says, I can only show you my how to get home if you take me back to school first. And instead of being, say, at a store or at a park or somewhere else, right? Because the child only knows the way home from school. That's what their mental map knows. Every map that you carry around with you has limitations, right? Limitations that you put on it, right? The more education, the more experience, your map opens up a lot. Okay, two big kinds of maps, reference maps, thematic maps. We're going to talk a lot about both. We're actually going to do some work with both. Basically, the word reference, you think about it, you refer to it. If I go to Disney World and I open up the map of the park and I say, oh, where are all the fast pass rides and where are all the roller coasters? Yeah, Space Mountain and Splash Mountain and Big Thunder Mountain. I want to ride all those. That's a reference map, right? If you have a highway map or an atlas of the 50 states, those are reference maps. If you have a world map and you're like, where is, Botswana? Oh, look, there it is. That's a reference map. A thematic map, on the other hand, tells a story. Theme is kind of an old word. If you've ever watched that old Christmas time movie, right? You'll shoot your eye out, kid. There's a part in there where the teacher says, today we're going to write a theme, right? A theme is a story. It has a plot. So think about thematic maps. How do we know what the story is? Well, read the title, right? The title is like, this is going to be, crops harvested, using, irrigation between 2010 and 2015. Okay, well, look, that's the story of that map. This map is probably about agriculture. One important skill you're going to have on the AP exam is whatever the title of the map is, it's going to give you a clue. What unit of the class does this come from, right? What should I remember? What are the big vocabulary words? What are the things that, Mr. Turner was telling us and teaching us? And what are the things that we did in class, right, that will help us to remember that unit of study, right? Those topics and those skills. So when we think about thematic maps, we're about to have another election, of course, in American history here. And you look at the states that vote, Democratic or Republican, and we turn them red or blue or purple, depending on toss-ups and this, and that, and the other. These are actually the states from the last election in 2016. And of course, red states went Republican, blue states went Democratic. What's interesting is I not only want to show you this as a theme, but I want to show you how changing scale changes your idea, right? Your perception. You look at the Deep South, for example, and it's solid red because we have a winner-take-all electoral college system, except for two states. Nebraska does not do that. It's proportional. And also, I think Maine is the other one that does that. It's proportional, right? You get an allocation. California, 53 electoral votes, right? As long as you win California, you get them all. And remember that, Mrs. Clinton won California by a huge number, but she only got 53 electoral votes for that, right? Whereas if Trump wins maybe one more vote in a lot of these other states, he gets all of those electoral votes as well. So this is important that you see how that works. Well, look, here we change scale. Those red states are not so red. Those blue states are not all entirely blue, right? Because by changing scale, we're getting a different picture, right? And this is why we sometimes say true maps, false impressions. It is a true map, but you get a false idea when you look at it, right? It's very interesting. So how are we going to use maps in human geography? Remember, we said that, we're looking for patterns and we're looking for processes. We're using a lot of technology nowadays. Big one is GIS, Geographic Information Systems. It's like a lasagna. You can tell by looking, I haven't missed too many meals, right? So when we think about layers of maps, I'll show you what that looks like in a second. We're acquiring data and then we're mapping that and we're putting the layers on a base map so that we can see, right, the geography. GPS, this is more of a locational system, right? It's going to give you an accurate location on the earth with a grid or coordinates. And remote sensing, taking pictures with drones or aerial photography, satellite imagery. Trust me, you're going to see this throughout the course where you're going to see distantiated perspectives of things, right? Pictures from far away. So this is what I mean by GIS. And certainly you can go out and search up the word GIS, literally type it in GIS in your computer and look at all of the data that just comes up on this. And this is what I meant when I said earlier about geospatial data and companies paying you a lot of money if you're able to acquire data and understand the data and be able to make decisions based on the data, right? And we're going to talk about that. All right, but when we think about GIS, the other thing to remember is that, like with any technology, all right, scale matters here, right? And we zoom in and we zoom out. Now, there's what we call cartographic scale or map scale, right? And this is where you've got those numbers, 1 inch equals 24,000 inches, or they give you the stick, the little graphical description of scale. And you say, oh, my thumb is about 150 miles and, 5 thumbs. How far is that? That's what we mean by map scale. But in this class, we're going to care a lot more about what we call scale of analysis. We see a map and we say, okay, this map's giving us a lot of data, especially if it's a thematic map. What level of the data are they showing us? Are they showing this information by county, right? Florida has 67 counties, right? So every little county is a different color. Are they showing it by state, right? All 50 states are different. Are they showing us this by region? Are they showing us this by country? Are they showing us this by region of the world? If it's a whole world map, be careful. It's not that the map is a global map. Yeah, that's a scale, but that's map scale. That's cartographic scale. We want to know what's the scale of analysis. If it's a whole world map, but every country's data is being displayed, it's at a country scale of analysis or a national scale of analysis. If they zoom in and they show you just Canada, and there's, all these provinces, And you're going to say, well, what's the scale of analysis? Well, if it shows the provinces, then we know that this is about each of those provinces, right, as an organization, right? And it's not about Canada as a whole, it's at that, regional level or provincial level of analysis. And if they zoom in and they show you just the state of Florida and they want to know which school systems are starting remotely and which are going back face to face and which are doing a hybrid model, hey, look at that. Now that's a local scale of analysis, right? They're breaking it down by county. This is what we mean by cartographic scale or map scale. And certainly you can see this as we go left to right. Now be careful. The thing about map scale that's important is that a small scale map is going to show you a very large area. And what that means is everything on the map gets really small, right? It's a big area, but it's small scale. If it's a large scale map, it's zoomed in and it shows, and the same thing happens, when you take a picture. If it's a selfie, if it's just you, oh, look, remember you always got to make the duck lips, right? Okay, there's my selfie. Well, my face is huge in that picture, right? Because it's a small scale, so my face gets really large. What if I'm taking a picture of the whole class, right? All freshmen taking human geography. Let's take a big picture together, right? We're going to do a pano and everything like that. What happens? Everybody in the picture gets really, really small, right? Because we have this huge, large scale area, right? So everything on there is small. So same thing here, right? You can take a pause and you can take a look at the state of Washington. And then you go to the area around Seattle, and then you zoom in on the city itself, and then you go into a few blocks of Seattle. Take a look. Notice that each map gets progressively different in scale. Look at the numbers. The big numbers show a big area, but that's a small scale map. Big numbers, small scale. Small numbers, large scale, right? Large scale map, very small area. Take a second, take a look. Okay, now, when we think about scale of analysis, here we are in the home stretch. Something that probably you guys have seen lately. If you were my student last year, about January, I started showing this in class almost every single day. We looked at the coronavirus spread, and we looked at it at different levels of scale of analysis. This is showing you the whole world, But if you notice that this is showing a country scale of analysis, this is cases by country. And so we see the borders on the map. We can actually see the borders of each individual country, and you can see the cases as they go. What if we change the scale of analysis and we zoom in? Okay, this is now just the United States. And look, now we're showing you the data by state, right? And so we see California and Florida, Texas, New York. Hey, does it make sense to you that those states also have the most people, right? Montana only has a couple 100,000 people. How many cases could there be, right? So when we think about this, this is how changing scale matters. This is how, being geographically literate, you can understand why they're choosing certain maps or showing you certain things, right? Depending on the perspective. What do they want you to see? What do they want you to think, right? Who's the person showing you the map, right? And what's the purpose behind why they've chosen that map? We can zoom in even one more time. Now we're looking at just in a local sense, right? This is just now Florida, and I can show you Palm Beach County cases, and we can zoom in just to where we live, right? So when you think about that, this is what we mean by scale of analysis. We're changing the scale. The data is all the same data, but we're choosing how we're showing that data based on the size of the earth that we're talking about, right? Scale of analysis. They love to talk about that when they get to some of the essay questions that you'll have on your AP exam that'll be coming up in May. Right? Hope you've enjoyed this slideshow. Feel free to smash comment buttons and, maybe hit a like for Spatial Shark. Old people, we like to be, thought of as, doing a good job. So if you have questions, certainly you can come into class and we'll talk about it as well. All right. But we'll be posting videos throughout. This is Unit 1. We'll come back with Units 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 as we go through the AP Human Geography course, right? In the meantime, be healthy, stay safe, help your parents. We'll talk soon.